Oleksandr Mykhed is a Ukrainian writer. Until March 2022, he lived in Kyiv. Now he is enlisted in the armed forces of Ukraine. He's the author of 9 books, selected essays, and excerpts from his books have been translated into 10 languages, probably more since this profile was written. He has participated in literary residencies in Finland, Latvia, Iceland, the USA, and France, and has had a virtual residency at Oxford University. He's written for publications including the Financial Times, Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, The Guardian, and has appeared as a guest on CNN and NPR. He is also a member of PEN Ukraine, and anyone who has heard him speak, such as the event in Waterstones in London with Luke Harding that I attended, will be able to attest at how compelling it is listening to Alexander talk about his novel and his experiences. Well, before we dive into that, thank you to everybody who is subscribed to the channel. If you're not, make sure you are so you don't miss out on any other fantastic guests. And thank you everybody to who's helped support our recent fundraisers to buy trucks to send to the front. As many of you will know, we managed to complete that. And as a group, that topped out at about 15 vehicles. Those are in the process of being delivered, and hopefully they will make a difference. And thank you to everyone who supported the channel as well through that time. Alexander, thank you so much for joining us.
Nice to meet you, Jonathan. Thanks for the invitation.
And I've been looking forward to this for a long time. I think your book is absolutely fabulous. We will put links to it, of course, in the description for anyone who hasn't heard of it. Although I think many of the audience will possess the book, will have hopefully read it as well, but some won't, and they're in for a treat. But let's start with, I think, a core theme here, which is an extraordinary and unexpected sort of dissonance between the identities that you've been forced into, a writer, intellectual, but also you've become a soldier as well. And that is certainly not something you would have expected or planned for in life. How does that sort of affect your sense of self? How does that affect your identity, perception of the world, even?
Um, I guess the reason why I'm in the armed forces is hidden in my intellectual background. It's like something that is strictly connected because throughout the year before the full-scale invasion, I was involved in the project about the classical Ukrainian writers from 19th and 20th century. And we worked together with my father on the podcast. And while I was researching, I realized that my views are getting more and more harsh throughout 2021. And when all the talks started, initiated about the possibility of the invasion and how the war might escalate on the higher other level, I've realized that my position on this is formed by my knowledge about the previous generations of writers and intellectuals. And this influenced just directly on my decision. And before the invasion, I remember how I, like throughout 3 or 4 weeks, I've hold my, we have this, I don't know how it's called properly in English. It's like kind of paper passport that you have as the wanna be a soldier, or as you are obliged to be in the lists for the possible
Hmm.
soldiers. So I had this document each time when I was outside of my house, and I thought that this is something that the void, the chaos that is coming from the eastern part of our neighbors, it's like this document might be much more important than, for example, ID card or passport or something. So when the full-scale invasion started, I've enlisted just, I guess, on the 28th of February, so 4 days into invasion. And at that time, we've lost our house in Hostomel. At that time, I've lost the connection with my parents who stayed in Bucha. And at that time, I finished my first text called The Language of War, which was so I consider this as a manifesto. That text was published in the beginning of March 2022 in the Financial Times, and that text, that's actually the first chapter of the book, and that this is the time for action. And I finished the text realizing that this is not the time for writing, this is the time for being enlisted in the armed forces and finally get to know how to use the rifle and be useful with my arms and not with my head. And that was some kind of the organic decision, because when you are losing everything, this is the answer. But on the other hand, through the training and through the first weeks in the barracks, I realized that my identity of the writer is something that I could not lose, and this is probably the only identity that's left when the invasion started. And throughout, like when we are talking, we are heading to the third anniversary of the full-scale invasion. And through all these years, like I'm realizing that this is the core and this is who I am, and I am a writer, and I'm telling stories, and this is who I am.
And it's interesting, isn't it? Because a lot of people didn't want to believe full-scale war was coming. A lot of people live their lives and they don't want to think about that, despite there being 10 years of continuous warfare in the East, but obviously at a much lower scale of intensity for most of that time. But with your knowledge of the executed Renaissance, the sort of the genocidal persecution of Ukrainian culture, the eradication by and large of it, plus many of the works that it gave rise to, especially, painting and so on, did that give you more of a sense of what was to come, that Russia would invade, and that when it invaded, it would bring back very deep and dark chapters of history with it?
Yeah, definitely, because I consider this as the continuity of what they've been doing for not for decades but for the centuries, and this is just the parts of the same genocidal puzzle that they're creating. And for sure, it lies in the even understanding of the what the communism and what the socialism and what the actual Soviet Union was. This is just the um, this that's the difference that lies in the core of our identities. Because for Ukrainians, and after especially the decommunization process that was initiated after the Revolution of Dignity in 2014, this is like a clear understanding that that was occupation. This is a clear understanding that at that time that was a true attempt of erasing the identity and sweeping off like who we are, and they will continue this. For Russians, this is the golden era of their life and for the existence of the Russian Empire as it is, and they would like to bring it back. And I think this clear understanding that these are the same instruments. These are the almost sometimes these are almost the same people who've been executing Ukrainian dissidents. For example, this famous story about Viktor Medvedchuk, who is cum godfather for with Medvedev and with everything, or with Putin. He is connected in that religious way. He was the lawyer for Vasil Stus in 1980s, and this is a famous story. And now he is one of the biggest collaborators and the person who was directly involved in the spreading propaganda. And this is really interesting because this is like they haven't finished it in 1980s, and they've came back in 2020 and again in 2014 as well. So these are the links of the same story, as well as there is a clear understanding that Russia will erase intellectuals on the first hand, as they're trying to decapitate the intellectual head of the state, as all those who are those who bring thoughts, those who could manifest the identity, and those who produce culture, and those who might produce education, etc. And they have these lists, and this is one of the most important things that they are doing on the first phase of any invasion.
This isn't a question I'd sort of planned on asking, but it's having seen and read a lot about sort of Soviet history, Tsarist history, it seems that this current version is a very manufactured, almost a satire in itself. It's a cosplay version of empire. People doing what they think their fathers did, playing out actual, not real history, but propaganda narratives, things that they've been brought up with over years and even decades. It's very real, of course, but at the same time, it has this sense of being entirely manufactured, along, of course, with the pointlessness of it all.
Yeah, because this is really interesting, because the ideology, the Russism version of the connection of the fascist plus Soviet nostalgia, and on new level the idea of the totalitarian society, it is based on the invented myth of the World War II in its Soviet propagandist version, that on the later iteration was connected with the Orthodox Church to make it the sacred national war, Великая Отечественная, which became a huge myth with its own martyrs and with its own saints. And this is absolutely ridiculous, as they are bringing the icons of Stalin and everything. And this is the exact illustration of this barbaric attempt of combination of the fake false history plus Russian Orthodox Church, and everything is based on the idea of the Tsar. And I think this is really important, that at a certain point Ukrainians started writing Putin with the diminutive letter, as some call it in the book, I call it as disease. But on the other hand, I think this might be the name for the state position, that it doesn't matter who will be next Putin, like it's gonna be somebody from his horde or it's gonna be somebody from its team, but it's gonna be next Putin, and this is just on the diminutive level, because this is the way of how they understand of how the politics should be built, and how they could get the whole society together in this integrity of hate.
And I've spent, as you have, as many Ukrainians have, I've spent many years watching Russian propaganda narratives play out and trying to pick them apart and relate them to historical myths, Soviet myths, and then more recent manufactured myths. But maybe, and that's because a lot of this stuff then doesn't stand out, because you're like, okay, I've heard this before, I've heard an iteration of it before. The thing that perhaps shocked me more than anything was Putin's last speech, where he essentially admits that he was bored. I mean, he basically says he was bored, and he seems to show such engagement and joy with the details of this, mythologized terror missile, the Oreshnik, with details of the offensives and so on. That's the only point at which there's any animation in his voice and face. That is perhaps to me the most shocking idea, that all of these games are simply because, rattling around in the Kremlin for year after year, more money than he knows what to do with. He is essentially bored. And this is a gigantic, psychotic game for him.
I think that each metaphor or each explanation except the genocidal attempt is making it seems easier, and I could not accept this. As well as on the early stage of the invasion, you might heard, especially from the Russian liberal thinkers, their attempt of comparing it, for example, with the Iliad by Homer, that there is this war and then there is this Trojan and everything. And each time when somebody is trying to make this genocidal act of aggression as either ancient story, either calling it game or whatever would be any comparison or metaphor, I think that we are downplaying the whole evil story that it is. And the only thing that is exceptional for me in terms of any allusions, this is World War II, but now we have Russists, but not Nazis, and this is the only comparison that is acceptable for me as the attempt of trying to explain what's happening. Because with the when you try to think about it in the terms of rationality, like you could not get that. And this is, for example, my explanation of what the genocide is for myself, as because each time when they're doing this, this is something that is beyond your imagination. This is the horror that there is unimaginable. And I for sure this is the explanation of a writer. This is not the lawyer's explanation what the genocide is. But when you think about the Kakhovka Dam, when you think about Bucha, when you think about Mariupol, this is something that you could not imagine, but they're still making it happen in the life. And the same thing with the whole full-scale invasion, the same thing with the Crimea, the same thing with Donetsk and Luhansk. Because could you imagine, with the same thing with the MH17, the same thing with Georgia in 2008, the same thing with the hospitals in Syria. Could you imagine that they would specifically make air bombardment of hospitals? This is the part of the strategy. Could you imagine that today, during the uh, meeting of the president with the UK Prime Minister, you would have Shahed in the center of Kyiv? But we had this today, and the aircraft system, anti-aircraft system, was working all allowed during like 12, like in noon. We had this, and that, like, you could, it sounds really crazy, but this is just our daily reality. And so yeah, that's the answer for this game.
And you've talked about the difficulty of language being able to express that reality they're experiencing, but also the inadequacy of language to describe things like Mariupol, the torture basements. And I know there have been attempts to describe it, actually some extraordinary ones, in literature and in sort of non-fiction prose as well. And 20 Days in Mariupol perhaps, achieved an impression on film that the language is inadequate to describe. What's your sense of a writer, though, grappling with, the inadequacies and limitations of language to describe what is going on and the horrors?
This is like this is now we're in the third year, and I am so wise in reflecting it, as this is not something new that happened, and I realized that a lot of it was made with my intuition and my understanding and the beginning, how I wrote the language of war, the whole book throughout the first 13 months. But now I realize that this working instrument, the language as it is, and my understanding of how I can make stories and how I can tell these stories. This is directly influenced by my conscious, because the conscious is fragmented, and a huge, uh, large amount of information. Like, I could not work with it. I need to work it with the paragraph. I could not grab the whole page, for example. And the same thing with the intonation that was transformed, this feeling of reality was transformed into my vocabulary, or in my style, how I talk about the war. As this is just direct language, direct, with very little usage of symbolics and metaphors. And when we speak about the war crime, or when we speak about the genocide, I think that the the best way of using the language and the possibilities of the any other artistic form is to use it as a document, and you have to put directly who, what, when, and how many. And this is the direct way of, because in my understanding, it's still hard for me to think about the fiction about the full-scale invasion, for example, as the reality is so horrible. So you just put the details, and you just put the logic of events one by one, and that's it. And the same thing with the documentaries, as I think they, at this point, they work much better than the fiction stories or features as well. So it's everything about putting this puzzle that could not be put together just fragment by fragment, and the rhythmic language, as this is the rhythm that my mind is working throughout these years.
And you talked as well in the book and in the interview that I got to see in London about there's a sort of grim practicality of the language of war, that people through their words find the path of least resistance to understanding each other when they're under duress and in dangerous situations. But that also can there can be some creativity embedded in that new form of communication that's parsed down to the bare minimum. What again is your experience of a writer of living and communicating, but also trying to potentially spot something let's say creative in a situation?
I think the best works about the full-scale invasion were made on the level when the author, an author, is really truthful, and when it's making you understand who's speaking. It's not the God voice, third point narrative of classic literature. This is my story. That what happened to myself, and this is how I got to know this story, this part of reality. And I think the best way of understanding how it works is 20 Days in Mariupol, when you have um, the witness of horror who's in the center of this storm. And still, Mstislav Chernov is doing a great job in terms of still making it in a way poetic, because there are those chapters when he thinks about his daughters and about time and everything. And I think this is the key point, that still, even in the form of the document, still in the form of nonfiction, and still when the epicenter of the focus of your interest is, or not the focus of interest, but like in the subject of your story is border crime, but still it's manageable to be a storyteller. This is manageable to express the grief, the anger, and everything. And that something like this. So my experience is that The Language of War is the most sincere book that I did, and as I realized that while I'm talking about the experience of my parents, while I talk about myself, when I talk about friends who we've lost, who've been killed by Russian invaders, or this is something that might be echoing the experience of my readers, and this is again something that might be mirrored in the history as well, and it might be something really understandable to people all over the world, because when a human being lost it home, that like you have the same feeling as well, the understanding of dad, mom, whatsoever faith as well, no matter what are you believing in, it still keeps you together in any given country.
The other challenge must be as well, again, you didn't choose to be in this role, you didn't choose to have these experiences, but as a writer, you may well have had, a plan to write certain things, certain books, certain dramas, which now no longer seem possible because those worlds have disappeared. What does the writer who wanted to write about, dare I say, small things rather than this big historical canvas, what do you do when those things are no longer possible? Adapt, find a new way of expression, or give up on this mode of expression?
I think in a lot of I think there is like the a writer who invented or been thinking about certain book or project, and this project was not concealed before the invasion. This is totally different person that the person who is going through the invasion. And it is so for myself, my experience is that I've just gave up understanding that this is in my circumstances, I'm not allowed to work on large fiction. As one hand, this is like you could not write a novel without being in the stream for 9 months, 18 months, just working on the daily basis on the novel. But on the other hand, I realized that still I could not believe. I think those projects are just left for that person who's been left in the pre-invasion reality.
I think listening to Andrei Kurkov, something very similar there. I mean, all the projects he was talking about were put on ice. And when he did go back, 2 years after the initial invasion to start writing fiction, it was through the prism of historical fiction, looking at Kyiv during the Bolshevik Revolution. And that's a way to examine contemporary issues, but it's distant enough from the present moment to be able to get back into that. You've written very compellingly in the book about this sense of being robbed of the past, that it truly is another country, now scarred by loss, trauma, and change, that actually words themselves mutate and transmutate. The meaning of language and symbols itself is like a spring that's been stretched. It can't go back to how it was before, and the perceptions of words are also fundamentally changed in some instances.
Yeah, but on the other hand, for example, I've been thinking that this is really hard for myself to think about time, because time is not working, and there is this something huge bunch of past, and sometimes you're thinking about like this is some kind of TV series that you've watched at a certain point of your life, and you consider this the thing that my experience, what happened to myself. This is another season, I don't know, of Breaking Bad or something, that I remember the main plot, but I don't remember the exact dialogues or something. And then there is the period of the full-scale invasion, and this is just, I don't know how to call it. This is just a pile of pain, and this is really hard to see the horizontal of how it's working. And I had to think, was it the summer of 24? Was it the summer of 22? It's everything all the same. This is just a dark of something, and that's it. And for sure, this is, for example, what has happened to the category of time for myself. And this is just, as well as there is no future as well, because there is no category of this, as this is doesn't work as for usual people who think, oh, I think I need to buy an apartment, and I'll have this job, and I will pay this credit for 10 years. It doesn't work like that. And and everything is ruined. But on the other hand, this feeling of living through a day and then living through at least week, it gives you, on the other hand, it all that the Western wellness TikTok philosophy talking about being in the moment. This is being in the moment as it is.
There's no other moment. And this brings me on to another topic, which I think is very difficult actually to articulate or even put the question forward. And that is the difficulty. I mean, you've talked about various issues, and I've spoken to Oleksandr Mykhed and Sasha Dozhik and many others about this, which is when Ukrainians are platformed with Russians, and that's now that that's been litigated, that's been discussed. But I think there's a real problem, especially those who may have some affinity or have had affinity with Russian culture or the imperial culture that is thought of as Russian national culture. We have a problem of actually dividing or looking at or feeling sympathy for the trauma of the victim and the aggressor. And there can be a tendency to sympathize with the trauma of both, not understanding that the sense of the ideas of victimhood and trauma play different roles in Ukrainian history as they do in Russian. And of course, in Russia, there is a tendency to weaponize the concept of victimhood and trauma as well. What's your sense of this, and how do you perceive that when, for instance, you're having to deal with people organizing Western events, the kind of questions they might ask that could be, let's say, rather tone deaf in some instances?
That's really interesting, because let's make it as a certain list of what I've been thinking through last months. I think that Western European culture, and I think the US as well, intellectuals, I think they're just waiting for the moment when they could start loving Russian culture openly, finally. Like they are ready. Like they this is something interesting. And I think, as well as the um, intellectuals, like, they like to think about Russia as the some kind of Cinderella story, that at a certain moment, oh, finally, 25 years after Putin's regime, they are finally they could work with it, they could love it, they could visit Moscow, and there's gonna be another democratic breath, etc. And I've read a really interesting book by a Polish journalist called Pavel Reszka, and this is his recent nonfiction fiction journalism about his life in Moscow throughout the last 2 decades. And this is really interesting, as he reminds for example, how Putin switched the chairs with Medvedev, and how Medvedev was in the end of his rule, he tried to initiate the existence or the process of making of two parties, and he would be the head of the Democratic Party, and Putin would be the head of the Conservative Party. And then Putin just bring him for another fishing, and for a week or something, and Medvedev came back and said, like, no, that was a stupid idea. Yes, for sure, we need one party. And for sure, the moment when there was this puppet figure of Medvedev, Western world was so delighted to finally fall in love once again with Russia. The same thing that the Western world is and was in love with Navalny as well. And this is something that they want to believe, that there is a human being, a democratic leader that they could speak to, but there is none of it. And if you'll have a check on the whole coverage of Navalny, this Patriot book, and what's happening, for sure you've seen it on.
And Yulia, they've transitioned the same attitude to someone who, in some ways, has done nothing to earn it.
Yes, yes, and still they like they try to omit the fact that he supported the Crimea annexion, and they try to pretend that his position on Crimea, that it's supposed to be a part of Russia, was a narrative that you are supposed to say because or to repeat, because this is the only narrative that allows you to be a possible candidate for president. And this is hilarious in terms of how it works. So this is one thing, that West is really ready to fall in love, or not in fall in love, but to finally manifest its support to Russia, and to finally that, oh, we can do this. And when we record this, this is the day when the British Film Academy nominations are like posted, and we know that Anora has like 11 nominations or 10 nominations or something like this. And the story about the Russian oligarch and the son of the Russian oligarch, and the part of movies in Russian, and they have two Russian actors in each presentation. And I follow the coverage of Anora on Medusa, for example, as the head of the Russian liberal media. And this is hilarious. They consider Anora as the Russian movie that is in lists for the best movies of the year and in all nominations. And this is really interesting how it works for them, as this is the manifest for them that the Western culture is ready to manifest its love. This is one point. Secondly, I think that I had, for example, the invitation to represent the language of war together with the translation of the life and the fate of Vasily Grossman in this particular country, as two translations. And this is really interesting, as they would like to put a Soviet book translation about the World War II together with the language of war. And I denied this, as I think the Grossman optics doesn't work and doesn't explain anything about the war, as well as I would not consider of explaining my works through the the work of the Soviet times. And thirdly, yes, I think that each time when we have the interview with the foreign journalist, each time we have the question about Russian writers and Russian figures, etc. And for sure, each time we have to explain something about our attitude or our understanding. But at a certain moment, I've just started to ask a question: why would not we talk about the executed Ukrainian writers, artists, and why would not you be interested in talking about our great ones? Why would we each time we are supposed to talk about Russians and their heritage in our eyes? And this is the part of the thing that I'd like to work on in future, to bring the amazing Ukrainian figures, cultural figures into world perspective, and to people would read them, visit their exhibitions, and listen to them, as this is just an amazing Atlantis of Ukrainian culture that should be discovered.
Before I go back on the theme of imperial culture, this is a question I was going to ask later, but it seems apposite at this point. And that is, do you have a sense of a new executed renaissance being underway? Because whereas it's a cruel irony that something like, there's been an acceleration, for instance, of the translation and discovery of the works of Victoria Amelina, for instance, but that's come after her death and partly as a result of it as well. Is there a sense that this is both an intensified period of creativity and recognition of that, but it's also an extraordinary period of the loss of talent and potential?
It's for sure, because it's it matters of how you would count, but we have this project made by Olena Gerasimyuk and Yevhen Lir, and they have the martyrology of how many Ukrainian writers have been um, killed, executed, or killed in action, or through the invasion. And the last time I checked, it was something like 140 names. And this is the answer, and this is the thing that's happening in each sphere. Like, I would put it more, not only the executed artist, I would put it as the executed sportsmen, I would put it the philosophers, taxi drivers, economists, IT guys. You would put any kind of category, and this is for sure, for the world media, the visible part is artists or something like that, or actors, for example, because we are losing like theatrical actors, movie actors, we are losing the camera guys, we are losing the light guys, we are like all kind of what I'm trying to say, that the genocide that's happening, it touches each sphere of life, and this is something that is invisible for the world media, but it is something like the top of it we see each day in our Facebook news feed, or any given social platform. We see these losses in terms when it's a little bit of media involved, but we don't see all of them, because this is just people who are involved in different agriculture or any given sphere, and this is what's happening. That's the tragedy of what's happening.
Well, let's turn to the Imperium, as it were, because the Empire is striking back. It's not just waiting for the war to end, and as you say, this sort of desperation amongst the privileged cultural elite to want to return to it, to the dewy-eyed Russophilia, as it were, that they want to embrace. There's this thing about not cancelling Pushkin. There was an article in The Spectator recently, it has to be said, written by someone who is, I think, by birth ethnic Russian, bemoaning the destruction. In this instance, it was of Soviet era monuments, etc., in Odessa. And he wrote very dramatically there that this, this destruction of historic identity was tearing the fabric of the city apart, tearing the culture apart. I haven't been to Odessa, but I'm fairly willing to bet that if I just did a straw poll of people on the street, they would present rather a different picture than was presented here. What is going on here in terms of the editorial choice, platforming these writers, platforming this sensational version of reality, which, in my view here, plays directly into Russian narratives?
This is just the thing that's happening throughout this decade of war, because those who've been interested in the, let's put it, Eastern European affairs, their basis for sure is grounded on the knowledge of Russian language and Russian sources and Russian universities, etc. And all other points on this world, they are, or in this region, they are connected with the something that is not so important as Russian. But then with the full-scale invasion, especially, they started to rethinking, they started to reconsider their past, and they're trying to understand what's happening. And the whole move of towards the understanding of the Ukrainian reality, Ukrainian history, is really okay. But sometimes, for sure, you see what's happening when you have the Russian-oriented guy who's having his worldview based on the Russian resources and still being the part of Ruski Mir concept, the Russian world. And that's what's happening. But on the other hand, for sure, in the proper editorial world, they would put the piece written by Ukrainian intellectual who would give the other perspective on this issue, and it won't be so authoritative as the one point idea as it is here. And for sure, if it's done, this is another sign of what I've said before, that they are ready to manifest their love and their appreciation to Russian culture, etc. And recently I've read the piece on The Guardian, and the guy just something lifestyle, something that the guy who said, like, I've each time when I want to check my social media, I start reading books, and I've read this, and I feel so inspired, and I feel so intellectual and everything. And the last line of it is, I feel so great, but still haven't had read any of Russians. And I'm like, and it was something that he's planning to do, and this is something as his intellectual bar for it. And this is really interesting, as this is still the part of the intellectual landscape, and this is something common, which was okay for sure for the editors, and for sure there is common sense. There's, you did Homer, you did Shakespeare, now you're ready for making Russians, and this is the world, and nobody listens. Like,
And if people are going to read it to understand the mind of Russian aggression, to understand the sources of trauma that lead to this aggressive behavior, that maybe, but they're not, are they? They're reading it in a sort of rose-tinted, romantic way, which completely belies the reality, unfortunately. Well, we're coming to the end shortly, and that kind of brings me to the idea of truthfulness, because this is a little bit sort of outside the book, because I think you deal with reality in a way that's highly poetic, but uses very direct and clear language. But it seems that with the rise of social media, with the unreality that we get through social media, where rather than striving for objectivity, it's things like manipulation of memory, memes, emotions. This seems to be a driving factor rather than what we used to call evidence-based stuff. What's your sense of the challenge ahead? Because it seems that truthfulness diminishes in inverse proportion to the quantity of information. And with AI and with social media, the quantity of information is only going to be expanding exponentially in coming years.
Yeah, I think this is a huge threat, and I was amazed with the, for sure, as all of us, with the decision of Meta of denying the or canceling the check trackers. And this is something beyond of my imagination, and how you could tell, but not to the common sense. And I still I don't understand its logics and how it works and how it is connected with the era that will start in just in on 20th of January. And this is a challenge. And if we focus on the issue of the Russian invasion and our experience, generally, I've been thinking that we're doing fine because finally the world media are not relying on TASS or any official message of the Ministry of Defense of Russia or something, as they understand that this is something that exists in the parallel universe. But on the other hand, we had this example with the Kakhovka Dam, when just immediately after the official announcement of Russian Ministry of Defense that they are not connected to this, and these are Ukrainian crazy Ukrainians who are to be blamed. This is the first message that went in the world media, and this is still amaze me. Why did they do that? And this is an example of how still huge is the threat in the strive for quickness, for speed of getting the information on the unreliable sources. And for sure, in the coming years, the whole idea of not like this is something about truth, and this is something about the fact, and the whole thing that we've throughout the decade, everybody who's been talking about alternative view or something, we're in the reality when this is beyond of this horizon of fake news. We are somewhere else. And I think this amazing piece by Anne Applebaum about the new rise of the mysticism and the new rise of conspiracy and obscurantism and the era of this is true. And this is for sure. And Applebaum doesn't know that today we got the official announcement of our Ministry of Culture that they could not influence the amount of the astrologists and numerologists who are guests on the Ukrainian news, and that each day we have this their forecast for the end of the war and the all events that are made by the astrologists. And this is hilarious because we are in these dark times globally, that those are masters of our mind. And yeah, this is a great question, Jonathan, and I have the answer. I'm just scared, as all of us are.
Absolutely. And I have the sense that it will be the quality of writing, the quality of stories that people tell that will get us out of this, or at least provide some immunity to it. One would hope. The last question here, your book ends on the phrase, I want to forget it all. I want to never forget, that ambiguity inherent in that. And 20 Days of Mariupol similarly ends there. I want to unsee, I want to forget all of this, but I cannot. And there's also this obligation not just to not forget it, but also to articulate it as well. So is this some of the thoughts that you may have had when writing that concluding phrase?
Yeah, I realized that it's not going through these 13 months of work on the language of war. It was for sure living through this. And this is a really hard experience, not just in terms of surviving through it, but in terms of being in this stream and working on this book. And for sure, I will remember these 13 months much better than all other days when I stopped working and stopped making this chronicle. And for sure, this is something, as Art Spiegelman has once said about his amazing mouse graphic novel. He said, like, now it's everything is casted, and now everything, like, my memory about my father and our family is cemented through the story. The same thing happened when you were working on the documentary nonfiction. Like, this is something that is inscribed on myself. So yeah, for sure, I realized that, and still, this is something that I'm supposed to live further.
Mykhed, thank you so much for appearing on the channel. I know the audience are going to appreciate it immensely. And for those who have not purchased and read your book, of course, there is the strongest recommendation to go out and do so. It's been described as one of the most powerful and groundbreaking works to have emerged from this period of war. And goodness, there are a lot of books have emerged. So to be considered one of the leading ones is certainly a triumph there. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you so much, Jonathan, and thank you so much for your community for still supporting us.